Welcome back, everybody. It's lovely to see you again, or rather, well, more realistically, you're seeing us. So welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we attempt to give Olympian judgments from on high, above all the factional squabbles of mere mortals. But unfortunately, we are mere mortals, and so it's a kind of a foggy day, and we're caught up in the very, what's the posh word? Pathologies. That's the one of the stuff that we're attempting to pontificate about. But we do our best. My name's Mike Pierce, by the way.
And my name is Coel Campo, and this is the second episode in our series called If Jesus is the Answer, You'd Better Know the Questions. And this one is called 3 Different 20th Century Arguments for Christianity that are still being used today. So most of our viewers will know that these kinds of arguments are called apologetics. And in the last episode, we looked at what that means and why apologetics matter and what the unavoidable problems and pitfalls are.
Right. And so today we're going to look at those, as you said, 3 modern types of apologetics, in the West at least, that were important in the 20th century. And the reason we're looking at them is because they're still widely used today. And we want to look at, amongst other things, what they are and how far they are, and sometimes are not, a good idea. So the 3 in question that we're going to be looking at, these 3 20th century models, one we can call Evidentialism, particularly as exemplified by Josh McDowell and a whole host of others, but he's easily the most famous. Secondly, what is often called presuppositionalism, which, although it doesn't begin with Francis Schaeffer, again, he's its most famous exponent. And thirdly, something that I'm calling, perhaps a little bit naughtily, the Via Negativa and the baptized imagination of C.S. Lewis.
These are some long words. Does this mean that we have to brace ourselves for something really complicated, or what do these terms actually mean?
Well, they're not really complicated. The second one is kind of philosophical, but it's not impossible to get our heads around by any means. The first one, evidentialism, is simply turning up evidence that seems to vindicate the statements made in the Bible, historical statements in particular. Presuppositionalism is a kind of philosophical argument that says that if we want to understand the world, we need to presuppose something. And Schaeffer and others argue that most sensibly that should be for the veracity of the biblical revelation. And the third one, the Via Negativa, well, really this phrase doesn't belong to C.S. Lewis at all. I've been rather naughtily applying it to him. It's really used by Thomas Aquinas back in the Middle Ages, and we're not actually going to be considering that today. He liked to say, to argue that we can define God only negatively, in that he is without limits, for example. So we can define God in terms of what God is not, rather than what God is. That's not C.S. Lewis's argument at all. It is negative in the sense that he takes on secular worldviews and basically tests them to destruction. But the other thing that I think we all know about C.S. Lewis is that he's a literary genius. And so he writes Christian fiction, amongst many other things. And that is often referred to not by others, not necessarily by me, as a baptized imagination. So, yeah, those. Well, the first of these we're going to look at then is this evidentialism, which was extremely popular amongst Christians in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and so on. And its most famous exponent by a long way was is this man, Josh McDowell. He's still alive. His son's now active in the same kind of ministry. He is the author or co-author of about 150 books. My gosh. And easily the most famous is his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Now, you can tell just by that title, it's kind of got its finger in your face from the very get-go, right? And it was ranked 13th in Christianity Today's list of most influential evangelical books published after World War II. And it's been through loads of different editions, and I haven't checked, I'm afraid, but I'm almost certain that it's still in print. I'd be astonished if it wasn't.
Wow.
Have you actually come across this guy or people who use his books?
I'm sure that I've heard his name or seen his books somewhere, but I'm afraid beyond that, I don't know much about him.
Okay, well, that's allowed. You're probably too young to have come under his sway, but your parents' generation, for sure, will, if they haven't read him, they will have had their ears tugged at some point by people who were strongly influenced by him.
I don't know, having written 150 books, though, I feel it's impossible to avoid him. I mean, it sounds like he's a bit of a workaholic, but I think that also suggests that some of them, at least, can't be very good.
Well, I have to confess, I have not read all of them, or even most of them. Yeah, but I couldn't avoid coming across Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and the general drift of his kind of argumentation. So I can't speak for the quality of all the books, but I mean the sheer number suggests there's got to be some kind of quality control issue there somewhere. And if there isn't, then there's clearly a number of extremely able people looking after him, so to speak, because nobody really quite knows that much. So what evidentialism attempts to do is to take on, so to speak, ideas that seem to contradict biblical statements. For example, concerning the historicity of events described in Scripture, or the textual authenticity of the various biblical books. You know, were they really written when they're generally believed to have been written? Were they really written by the people they claim to have been written by, and so on?
So basically, counteracting all of the 19th and early 20th century biblical criticism that produced like old style liberal theology.
Yes, the sort of stuff that that produced the flavour of liberal theology that was very keen on debunking and tended to reign in a lot of the colleges in the late 19th and, as you say, early 20th centuries, and indeed down to the mid 20th century. Really, yeah, he's taking on all that kind of stuff. Now, there are some advantages to this kind of approach because this job really needs doing. Because if certain key biblical claims can be shown to be simply false, then there are greatly reduced grounds for believing Christianity's central claims, and none for believing in the Bible's reliability for certain kinds of Christians. And I suspect the general background from which McDowell himself came, Christianity's central claims and the Bible's reliability are seen as being basically one and the same thing. Now, in practice, a lot of biblical claims can be backed up by evidence. I think we threw out, if I remember correctly, one general statistic when we did our first series on the early church a few months ago. So, for example, nobody in their right mind doesn't believe in Caesar's invasion of Gaul and the Gallic Wars, right? But the oldest document that we have for that goes back just to the 9th century AD, so about 900 years after the events themselves, and we've got about 5 or 6 manuscripts that are that old, and they're about the second best recorded events in ancient history. But
Mm.
Like I say, nobody in their right mind would not believe them. And concerning the events of the New Testament, we've got up to 5,000 documents, the oldest of which goes back to within 100 or 150 years of the events described. I mean, it's really a non-contest. These are easily the best recorded events in ancient history. So he's, kind of patrolling that kind of area, and that's a good thing because it encourages existing Christians in their faith, and it also encourages interested non-Christians to inquire further. And we are right not simply to surrender to currently modish opinion or academic consensus among specialists, which will in any case change over time. Now, that doesn't mean we should be simply arrogant or totally dismissive of it. We need to engage, but engaging is what McDowell is doing at a very popular level, not necessarily at the cutting edge of scholarship.
So, in your professional opinion as a historian, we can trust the Bible as a historical document. Is that what you're saying?
I would say overwhelmingly yes, certainly in respect of the New Testament. But I'm not quite sure if you're flattering me or making fun of me as in my professional opinion, because of course I'm not finally a biblical scholar. I'm a historian more generally, and I would instantly defer to people from the New Testament department and the Old Testament department who know far more about this than I do.
I really
Stir
just
the
wanted
pot.
to catch you saying it on tape.
Right. You're just too kind to me. This is the trouble with you. Well, there's a few
Yes.
other things as well. But never mind those for now. Right, okay. Moving swiftly on. There are disadvantages of this kind of approach. Firstly, it requires skills in a huge range of disciplines: ancient history, archaeology, languages, textual analysis and criticism, numismatics, study of ancient coins and so on, and others which almost no one actually has. So the apologist is tempted to pose as if he had all these skills, which can lead to mistakes and not being taken seriously.
Does that
Yeah.
mean that McDowell really is an expert in all of these fields? I mean, is that even possible?
I doubt that he is, and the reason for that is I doubt that that is actually even possible. He is going to be relying on other experts who are sympathetic to the case that he's trying to make and presenting their findings. I mean, I'm sure, because he's been dedicated to this task over his whole life, basically, that his area of expertise is going to be both broadening and deepening as he goes along. But he can never be at the cutting edge of more than one or two of these things, if indeed at any of them. He is essentially a popularizer. And that's not to be despised. But all I'm pointing out is that it's got its limits. And it also, this approach mounts gigantic pressure on the apologist, as if his entire case would fall apart from being wrong on just one point. And I suppose we should also point out that this way of defending the faith, if you like, apologetics, lends itself to fundamentalism and its unadmitted modernist view of what constitutes truth.
Okay, so fundamentalism is a word that gets used a lot, and everybody seems to define it kind of in their own way. So, how are we using it here?
Okay, yes, one of my many bugbears, and you know better than most people in the universe that I have a number of bugbears, and this is one of them, is how fundamentalism is grotesquely misused the vast majority of the time. And I'm not just here in this episode, but when we come across this phrase again in other series, as I'm sure we will, I'm going to be absolutely dogmatic in defining the thing narrowly and clearly, right? Because in popular parlance, it simply means going further in a particular direction than the person speaking happens to like, or even refers to, oh, I don't know, being a stickler for conservative cultural mores concerning the length of men's hair or what men or what women may wear or something. And this is all ridiculous. Those things actually may come out of a fundamentalist mindset. But let's define what we mean by fundamentalism. In defense against the onslaughts of the old style liberal theology and biblical criticism that you referred to a couple of minutes ago, a very large number of evangelical Protestant Christians in the early 20th century rallied together, sank a load of their doctrinal differences, which were often very big, around a series of booklets. They published a series of booklets financed by several wealthy Christian businessmen and were distributed free to every Christian worker in America. And they were called the Fundamentals. And they were laying out what they understood to be, mostly rightly, the basics of Christian faith, but with a very heavy emphasis on the inspiration and authority and historicity of Scripture. Now, so a fundamentalist in meaning number one meant someone who adhered to the fundamentals. So to speak about, I don't know, in more recent times about a fundamentalist Islam or fundamentalist Catholicism or even fundamentalist Greens, I mean, this is all nonsense talk, right? This is nonsense talk. And the people using those expressions need to find other words to explain precisely what they mean, because otherwise it's just become a boo word, and then it becomes harder and harder for us to talk to one another because we're just using words as terms of abuse or something like that. Okay, but fundamentalism does come down to an even more specific meaning as a result of certain events in the early 1920s, which we will certainly dedicate an episode to in some future series, particularly around a famous or even notorious court case in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, the so-called Dayton Monkey Trial. And this was about the teaching of evolution in state schools. Can't go into the specifics here, but basically since then, fundamentalist came to mean someone who insists upon a literalist reading of Scripture, regardless of whether that is the sensible and indeed intended by the authors meaning of Scripture, right? And particularly in respect of the early chapters of Genesis. So if you've come across people, and I'm sure you have, and certainly I have, who make an absolute fetish about six-day creationism, right?
Yes.
That is fundamentalism. So now that gives rise to a whole mindset, and we could say so much about that, but we're not, because that's not really our subject today. But this is part of the background for Josh McDowell and his kind of apologetics. So if he's defending the historicity of Scripture, I mean, are we going to defend the literal historicity of Genesis chapter 1? And what about the fact that that's not quite the same as the statements made in Genesis chapter 2? Quite apart from the fact that that's not actually the proper way to understand those texts in the first place, right? So, and then you could go on to a whole load of other things. So it comes from that kind of a background. The itch to do this comes from that sort of a reading of how Scripture works. And fundamentalism has an unadmitted modernist view of what constitutes truth. That is, here is a sentence, and every sentence, certainly in Scripture, not going to say they do that the way that you and I talk, but certainly statements in Scripture work on the cat sat on the mat kind of exegesis, right? The cat sat on the mat has basically only one meaning, and a literalist one, and that's how we're to read Scripture. That's a very modernist sort of approach, and that doesn't work. Never mind it not work with a lot of Scripture. It doesn't work with a whole lot of other pre-modern texts, as we could very, very, very easily prove, right? Which is why it's not always the most rational way to read some parts of Scripture. But we're not going to get involved in that now. We're just saying that's what McDowell and his evidentialism comes out of. That's not to rubbish his whole enterprise, right? Because quite a lot of what he's doing needed doing. The key problem with this, even taking everything completely in his own terms, is that the ground is constantly shifting in terms of what constitutes the evidence at a given moment, or the academic consensus, or something like that. Now, this is not a temporary problem which can be fixed. It's a permanent state of affairs. So the assured findings of science or archaeology or textual criticism in 1900 often, or even mostly, look absurd today. In fact, the balance has swung back since about 1900 much further towards accepting biblical accounts of certain events. But the point I'm making here is not that it's going either for the Bible or against it. I'm simply pointing out that the ground is constantly shifting. So if my case for the Bible, of the kind that McDowell's making, is based upon being squared with the evidence from the nature of Canaanite religion, or the kings of Tyre, or the status of Ephesus in the Roman Empire, as the evidence looks now, what happens in 50 years' time when quite a few rocks have been turned over in the Middle East and the evidence looks rather different, and the case that you've just built up now is completely out of date, and you're going to have to re-square your case for the new picture that's emerging. That makes one look rather hypocritical or inconsistent, right?
Isn't all of history, I mean, the study of any part of history would be susceptible to this, though? Like, as time goes on and we learn more information, or turn over more and more rocks, as you say, this is the pitfall of studying history.
It's certainly a feature of studying history. I mean, I am more impressed, actually, not simply by the emergence of new data, though that's certainly going on all the time, as by the changing questions that are being asked with each passing generation. This is a huge topic in itself. We refer to it in, I think it's the second episode of our little mini-series on history, about historiography, right? The historiography is the history of studying history. And the questions that people ask from one generation to another, or the things that they're trying to engage with or trying to prove or whatever, change enormously. So, back when I was alive, as I mentioned last week, everything was dominated by economics, and, the Marxists ruled the roost and all the rest of it. And now everything's about identity and all this kind of stuff, or attempting to find, to resurrect suppressed minorities' history back in the dim and distant past. There's some fairly dubious enterprises going on there as well. But nevertheless, there's been this enormous change. Why has this happened? Because we ourselves have changed. Right? Maybe this applies to biblical studies as well, because the newer liberalism tends not to be very interested in disproving the historicity of biblical claims, but in trying to argue that biblical texts were understood in the past in some sense that would be pleasing to postmodern adherents of postmodern ideologies. Right? To prove that this text could mean practically anything.
Right.
So that's what postmodern liberalism is like. That this text can mean what I want it to mean. So yeah, this is going on right across the historical realm, I guess.
That's good to know.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's compare, or listen to John Frame comparing that way of reasoning with the thing we're going to look at next, which is presuppositionalism. John Frame is a very big reformed thinker, and author of probably about as many books as McDowell, actually. In his book, 5 Views on Apologetics, he observes that McDowell's approach to apologetics falls under what Protestant theologians classify as classical and evidential. So, evidentialism. It's assumed that arguments defending the Christian faith can legitimately be directed to both believers and unbelievers because the human mind is viewed as able to comprehend certain truths about God. Presuppositional apologetics, on the other hand, questions this methodology by arguing that since unbelievers partially suppress and resist the truth about God, Romans 1:18-20, which we'll come back to in a bit, the problem of unbelief is also an ethical choice and not simply a lack of evidence. So Frame's Calvinism is tilting him here towards the presuppositionalist approach and saying people, our minds are so corrupted that you can't simply push around evidence as though it was something neutral towards human minds, as though they were something neutral, because they're not. They're sinful. They're tilted against God.
So basically, the first one, evidentialism, is just dealing in cold hard facts, and presuppositionalism. Now we're going to get a little more philosophical here.
Yes, we are. We're going to get quite a lot more philosophical, though we're going to try and keep the temperature down a little to make sure everybody stays with us. Now, we're going to look in particular at this man, Francis Schaeffer, not because he was the first in this mould, but because he was by far the most influential at a popular level. Right? Millions of people have read his books. His most influential is this trilogy, published 1968-72, so just around the time of the emergence of the counterculture and the hippies and so on. The first is the God Who Is There. The second, Escape from Reason. And thirdly, He Is There and He Is Not Silent. That last one is a fantastic title. Actually, it was the second one that I read first. And that and another book by C.S. Lewis that we're going to come to in a bit. Those two little books between them, they're both very short, basically got me embarked on an academic career because they made me realise I could, after all, handle these kind of big ideas and philosophy, and I actually enjoyed it. And at the time, I found Schaeffer's argument compelling, though I have major reservations now, which we'll come to in a bit. Now, what is his argument? So, like a lot of 20th century Reformed theologians, Schaeffer borrowed from Cornelius Van Til. Van Til remains very influential amongst intellectual and sometimes just pseudo-intellectual Reformed types today. On this way of thinking, people are utterly depraved. Now, we need to define this here. Even such a non-reformed person as myself thinks that people are utterly depraved, or at least I know I am. But what I and perhaps people like me mean by that is that everything that we do and think is contaminated by sin, right? Whereas in the Calvinist view, they would go a lot further and say that everything is utterly distorted and completely unreliable, that it's actually sinful in itself. And so our reason is not to be trusted. And mere rationalism, as it emerges from the Enlightenment, untethered or attempting to be untethered to religious belief of any kind, leads to meaninglessness and despair. And that certainly is true. And that really is where our society is at today. Right. So this analysis, it's certainly not entirely wrong.
It's also not exactly an attractive statement for trying to win someone over.
No, it's not. But as with a lot of arguments, and not just in this area, but in all kinds of areas, I don't know, ethics, art, politics, history, anything you like, if someone wants to get hold of truth, they're going to have to listen for more than just the length of an internet meme or a sentence or two. They're going to have to let an argument play itself out and see where it goes. And we're not very good at that, are we, these days?
No.
Well, Schaeffer argued that a mere leap of faith might lead anywhere. This is what is sometimes called radical fideism, right? A radical like faith in faith. That could lead anywhere. There's no way we can evaluate differing truth claims. If you're just going to make a leap of faith, you might become a Hindu, you might become some kind of a mystic or an atheist or anything. It's just a leap in the dark. So it's argued we have to presuppose something, not just anything, that answers the questions that naturally arise from the facts of our existence. Now this is again one of the strong points, I think, of Schaeffer's case. Usually, when people today use a term like presupposition, what they mean is something that's behind your ideas that you haven't examined yet, and when you do examine it, you'll see it to be false, right? Something that we can assume is going to turn out to be wrong. And Schaeffer's saying, well, you can use it that way, but it can also mean this, that we can choose a presupposition. If we choose this presupposition, it actually explains and answers the questions that naturally arise from the facts of our existence. Now, I think that's a very good point. I'm less persuaded by the thing that he chooses. He chooses that something should be the truthfulness of the Bible. And by truthfulness, he means something very close to what McDowell would have meant, actually.
Is there a reason that he chooses that specifically? Like, why wouldn't he presuppose something like the existence of God or something like that?
Right. I think that would have been a much wiser choice, actually. Or maybe go a little further than that, the existence of the kind of God that is revealed in the Christian tradition, because merely believing in God as a first cause, I mean, even deists would accept that as the logical answer to a question, where did all this come from? But if we want to understand why human beings are the way they are, so distinct from the rest of creation and from the rest of the animal kingdom, then we're forced back onto something like the Jewish and Christian idea that people are created in the image of God. That makes more sense in understanding ourselves and the world we live in. But that's just me. I'm pointing out what he thinks, what he says, right? And he says the result of this is a rationality that's not mere rationalism. Right? We can be rational, but rationalism, that is reason untethered from any presuppositions about God and so on, simply leads to irrationalism, as indeed it was doing in his own day. And he was right about that. And we continue to see that in our own time. All right, to see this case perhaps at its strongest, let's take a little chunk from one of his books, Escape from Reason, the one that had such a big influence on me in my early 20s. So he's criticizing academic and popular existentialism. So the same picture, he says, that emerges from secular existentialism is present in Karl Barth's system and the new theologies. Quick sidebar here. Karl Barth, we've got his picture here, was a Swiss Reformed theologian and a champion of what is now called neo-orthodoxy. Karl Barth was subject to all the usual influences during his theological education, debunking the historical claims of the Bible and drastically modifying his understanding of traditional Christianity. So he was a classic old school liberalism. And then came the First World War with absolutely devastating results. And as for millions of people, not just in Christian or religious contexts, but millions of people, it shattered his faith in modernity and Western Enlightenment-derived rationalism. Barth held, and still holds, Schaeffer was writing in the year that Karl Barth died, actually, the higher critical theories, debunking the historicity of the Bible. So the Bible contains mistakes, but we are to believe it anyway. Religious truth is separated from the historical truth of the scriptures. Now Schaeffer thinks this is a false move, that you can't do this, that the religious truth of Scripture depends absolutely on its historical reliability. So on that, Schaeffer wouldn't disagree with McDowell. He's just taking a different approach. Whereas what Karl Barth was saying was that the Bible doesn't reveal facts about God. The Bible reveals God, which sounds, of course, extremely spiritual, as so many theologies do when they start out. And then when you get further down the road, you turn around and look and think, what the what? The what? Anyway, that was Barth's approach. So he's reinstating something like traditional orthodoxy, neo-orthodoxy, while still embracing the old liberal style debunking of the historical claims of Scripture. Thus, Schaeffer says, there's no place for reason and there's no point of verification, because you've got religious claims up here and you've got the historical stuff down here. This constitutes the leap of faith in religious terms. Man made in the image of God cannot live as though he's nothing, and thus he places in the upper story all sorts of desperate things.
Sorry, in the upper story here being the realm of meaning as opposed to the realm of mere physical facts?
That's right, exactly. And in order to illustrate that it doesn't matter what one places in the upper story, I'll try to show how manifold these things are. We've had example of Sartre's existential experience. Jean-Paul Sartre was a very influential secular existentialist philosopher. Jasper's, another existentialist philosopher, Jasper's final experience, and Heidegger's Angst. Angst is this quite hard to translate German word that's somewhere between dread and anxiety. And these three all wanted to claim that the thing they were pinpointing showed us that even though the world is irrational, we are nevertheless fully real if we can have some kind of experience in this upper story like that. In each case, man is dead as far as rationality and logic are concerned. Aldous Huxley made a titanic addition to this way of thinking and advocated the use of drugs. So if you take drugs, you can get out of your head, as would be said nowadays, and have some kind of strange experience that would convince you that despite the meaninglessness of a purely material world, you are somehow nevertheless real. So as people are deciding that our culture is, in the words of Timothy Leary, sort of hippie guru, a fake prop set society, they too are turning to drugs. The hippie period was the high tide of drug use. Well, high tide until then. It's even higher now for slightly different reasons. In a BBC third programme broadcast, this always makes me laugh because that expression is showing the age of this book, 1968. There hasn't been a BBC third programme for a long time now. Anthony Flew, who was an atheist philosopher, and by the way, an extreme old age in his 90s, changed his mind and decided he believed in God. He didn't become a Christian, but he changed his mind about his atheism. Anyway, but at the time, and of course Schaeffer couldn't know otherwise, Anthony Flew, an atheist, addressed himself in this radio program to the question, must morality pay? And he used the broadcast to show that on the basis of his own rationalistic presuppositions, morality does not pay. And yet he cannot stand this. At the very end of the program, he brings out of thin air the concept that, in spite of the fact that morality doesn't pay, a man is not a fool to be scrupulous. The significant thing is that rationalistic, humanistic man began by saying that Christianity was not rational enough. Now he's come around in a wide circle and ended as a mystic, though a mystic of a special kind. And here comes the sentence that I think justifies the whole of Francis Schaeffer's life. It's a brilliant sentence. He's a mystic with nobody there. I just fell about laughing the first time I read that. It's so true, so funny, so brilliant, right? The modern rationalistic, atheistic people have ended up as mystics, but a mystic with nobody there. The old mystics always said that there was somebody there. But the new mystic says that does not matter because faith is the important thing. It's faith in faith, radical fideism, whether expressed in secular or religious terms. The leap is the thing and not the terms in which the leap is expressed. So if you've ever heard anybody say to you, and even this has gone a bit passe nowadays, but maybe you've heard such a thing, someone say to you, "Oh, I'm glad you have that faith. It's true for you, and that's nice for you." Right? That's
Yes.
what's going on in their minds. Right? The
Yeah.
leap is the thing, not the content, and not its truth, because there's no point of verification.
Right. Like everybody believes in something, but it doesn't matter that we don't all believe in the same thing.
Right. 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 Okay, what are the advantages of this kind of approach? Well, it engages properly with philosophy, and we've tried to keep that as light as we can. But I think many viewers can already see that this is going to engage at least some philosophical discussion here. It takes full account of human fallenness, including the fallen state of our minds. And it provides useful tools for Christian engagement with art and culture. And a lot of 20th century fundamentalism have been very bad at this. So this was a good thing. Right? In fact, Escape from Reason, which we've just taken looking at that quote from, that was a very brief account of Western cultural intellectual history from the 13th century as Schaeffer saw it. And in part, it's fairly persuasive. At the time, I was completely persuaded. I'm much less so now, but never mind that. It required a theory of history, Western history at least, to back up its claims. And then there's the effect. It did, in fact, reclaim many young adults in the 1960s and 1970s who had abandoned Christianity for the hippie-ish counterculture.
Now, that would have included you, right?
Well, yeah, I was sure you were going to get your insult in there. Right. Well, um, it, in theory, people like me and my sort of age, yes. So if you want an age dig there, you've got it. But in my particular case, no, and that on two counts. I wasn't being reclaimed because I wasn't coming from a Christian family that I then kind of I hadn't walked away from Christianity in the first place. And secondly, I was already a Christian of several years standing, maybe about 5 years standing, or four maybe, when I first encountered this. But nevertheless, it, let us say, to borrow early Quaker language here, it spoke to my condition. Sounding like George Fox there, because of course I was of exactly the kind of mentality and age cohort that Schaeffer was speaking to. Yes. Okay, people have been waiting for the disadvantages. Here they come. This approach only really works within the framework of Reformed theology for reasons we could go into, but I don't want to wander too far into the theological thicket here. We'll just say that that is so. It depends on a distinctively Calvinist view of total depravity as applied to our intellectual faculties. Whereas most of us who are not of that persuasion, let us say, would want to say, well, of course, our minds are depraved and fallen along with the rest of us, but that doesn't mean that we're completely incapable of apprehending truth at all. Otherwise, frankly, there wouldn't be much point in evangelism. You know? It is extremely Western in its approach, especially concerning art, culture, and history. It pays almost no attention to other societies, excusing itself by arguing that only Western societies have been informed by what they call the biblical worldview, which is its code rather, for Reformed Protestantism. Now, listeners, viewers who are interested in following through on this, please look at the comments on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you're looking, because there is going to be a link there to an article I wrote a while ago on Substack, looking at the whole idea of a biblical worldview, the biblical worldview. Are these things possible? What do they mean, or what should they mean? So please do have a look at that. We were just going to touch on it for now. So, appropriately enough, for people who think like this, it idealizes the Reformation and its culture, which it thinks of as being the perfect, or as near perfect as you're going to get, representation of the biblical worldview. And it clearly views that as normative for Christians, and indeed for Westerners generally, and indeed for people generally. So, in a world that has maybe gone a little bit too far in terms of cultural relativism, this is not going to have an awful lot of take up today, right? Unless you're prepared to idealize the culture of Reformation Europe, and that's going to be fewer and fewer people, and those generally only within particular theological backgrounds. This is going to have less purchase than it would have done in the late 60s and early 70s. But the key problem is that it makes being a Western modernist a precondition of being a Christian. Now, it correctly identifies existentialism and relativism as an overwhelming obstacle to evangelism, right? Because if somebody's an existentialist, well, anything might be true. So how can you make any particular clear claims, whether concerning Christianity or anything else, right? And if you're a relativist, well, what's the reason for upholding this rather than that, even in the area of ethics? And so how am I supposed to see myself as a sinner, right? So he's quite right in identifying those things as being big problems. But his apologetics insisted on terms, and I know you will have encountered these, used by a lot of Christians, like objective truth and moral absolutes, right? Yeah, you've heard those used a lot?
Yeah, I think I heard objective truth thrown around just last week, actually.
Oh, okay. But these are modernist terms, and they depend on an Enlightenment worldview. Pre-modern people had managed perfectly well without them, as had non-Westerners at all times, right? They talk about morality and about things being true, or even about truth, but you don't need to stick objective in front of it, because that assumes that there's, well, to use the jeering postmodern expression, that is a view from nowhere, that you're somehow standing outside the universe, right, looking objectively into it,
Right.
rather like the Greek gods on Olympus.
Well, there you go.
There you go. That's it, right? Which is why we make the disclaimer that it's always pretty foggy. And so this whole way of arguing conveniently forgets that modernism had been very unkind to Christianity, and yet it seems to imply, it never quite says, but it strongly implies that the person who's a kid in the 1970s needs to stop being an existentialist and go back to being a modernist so that they can become a Christian. Right? It's almost like the Judaizers in the first century. You know, here's a Gentile. Wait a minute. You've got to become a Jew first, and then you can become a Christian. Right?
Yeah.
And this just isn't going to work. You know. Okay, and finally, and I realise that what we're going to say here is going to leave a lot of people unsatisfied because it's a huge topic. We come to the Via Negativa and the baptized imagination of C.S. Lewis. Now, I've used the term Via Negativa because, although C.S. Lewis would never have used the crude analogy that I'm about to, the first two lines of argument have kind of assumed that apologetics works on the basis of a geometry theorem, the kind of thing that I'm sure it hasn't been done for a long time now, but back in the late Middle Ages when I was in school, we did geometry theorems to prove that the sum of the angles within a trapezium always made 360 degrees, and you would go through the whole process line by line, and at the end it would come to QED, quod erat demonstrandum, which was to be proved. Right, and so both the evidentialist and the presuppositionalist approaches seem to imply that apologetics should work on the model of a geometric theorem, whereas Lewis's methodology implies that it works instead on the model of a barroom brawl, with orthodoxy the last man left standing. Now, of course, he would never have said that, but I did. So basically, what he's doing is taking on secular approaches in their own terms and testing them to destruction. Not in everything he writes, but in a lot of his best work. Well, to quickly review his biography, most people know it, but just to refresh our memories and perhaps to tell those who aren't familiar with him, he's born in Belfast in 1898. He started to teach in Oxford in 1925. He had been an atheist, but he was converted to Christianity in 1931. He became Professor of Medieval and Renaissance Literature for most of his career in Oxford, but in the last few years of his life, he committed treason and went to Cambridge. He's the author of works on literary criticism, which was his day job, of course, but also works of popular theology, apologetics, children's literature, obviously the Narnia series, for which he's most famous, and what is sometimes called science fiction. But I mean, of course, it wasn't really scientific at all. I don't think he had a scientific bone in his body. It was really an exploration of philosophical and moral themes under the thin guise of travelling to other planets. Well, a number of his most important works were Miracles, The Problem of Pain, and Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity was a load of radio talks given for a general public during World War II. I find it hilarious now that a lot of students that I taught thought that this was amongst the most taxing reading that they had ever encountered. It was just intended for Joe's soap back in 1942 or 41, whenever it was. Yeah, but perhaps his most difficult, but easily most worthwhile apologetics book is The Abolition of Man. And it was this, along with me reading Schaeffer's Escape from Reason, that, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, basically changed the course of my life and set me firmly on an academic career. Whereas with Escape from Reason, I would accept part of its arguments with huge reservations. The Abolition of Man has now been downloaded into the operating software of my brain, and I'm ashamed to tell you I have more of its phrases ringing around in my head than even those from the Bible.
Well, I always had lots of reason to like C.S. Lewis, but I'm even more grateful to him now.
Right. Oh, that was almost kind. My gosh, you better go and have a lie down. Okay, I had to read a number of his sentences twice when I first encountered it when I was like, I don't know, 23, something like that. And not every sentence, but a number of them. But once I'd actually got it, I realized this was utterly brilliant and the arguments were completely unanswerable. And I remain as convinced of that today as I was then. His book achieves three things. It successfully confronts the fact value gap created by modernist rationalism. As he says, from propositions about fact alone, no practical conclusion can ever be drawn. And that's important for him because he's pushing back on supposedly modern forms of ethics, supposedly rational forms of ethics. And he's saying you can't derive them from science or reason. It can't be done. Right? The first moral principles are to ethics what axioms are to science. Unless you accept them as data, as given, you can never get anywhere. They are, as it were, the back wall, and you can't get behind them. His book demolishes the idea then that we can invent new moral systems. There is what he calls the Tao, traditional morality, or there's nothing.
Now, the Tao that he's referring to is not the Chinese religion.
No, but he's using that expression because it comes closest to what he wants to say. He's talking about the common stock of traditional moralities, the things that overlap between traditional cultures of all kind, not just Judaism and Christianity, but Islam, ancient Chinese civilization, anywhere, right? That yes, there are differences between them, but the commonalities are far more striking. And as I shall mention in a moment, that's like a huge vindication of what Paul says in Romans chapter 1. So he defends traditional morality without once invoking the name of God, but he makes inferring the reality of a self-revealing God, theism, almost irresistible in consequence. There's one extremely naughty sentence in the book. He says, I'm not here attempting an indirect argument for theism. But if I'd been sitting in the room when he gave that lecture the first time, I would have burst out laughing and shouted out, you liar. Because of course he is. If we accept what Lewis is telling us, then theism comes in by default. Well, just as a reminder here, where this traditional morality comes from, at least in the Christian view, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifested in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they're without excuse. So morality and the reality of God is built into the fabric of creation itself. And Lewis's book is a massive vindication. When I say massive, I mean it's only 60 pages, for goodness sake. What I mean is it's extremely powerful vindication of that. Now, we are at some point going to have a future mini-series looking just at this book because its ramifications are gigantic. So if some, or indeed many viewers are profoundly dissatisfied with how little we're saying here, be consoled, this is coming. So his argument simultaneously renders the rationalist take on ethics ridiculous because self-defeating. He defends traditional morality as the only game in town, and he creates a potential common arena for moral discussion between believers and non-believers, if they will accept it. So, of our three methodologies, I think that none of them is without their merits at all. But as we already pointed out in last week's episode, apologetics tend to have a sell-by date. And I suspect that the first two have either passed their sell-by date or are rapidly approaching it. And I don't think Lewis's is at all. That's not to say that will never happen. I mean, even within the abolition of man, there are signs there that he's taking on what we can call high modernism, and that's not where we're at now. But nevertheless, the core of his argument is still highly applicable today.
Right, because it's broad enough to, like you said, disprove unbelief in God, basically.
Yes, and just by, I mean, he's already putting out a willingness, and indeed is exemplifying engagement with a whole load of non-Western cultures and showing the things that they have in common, and thereby preparing a ballpark, so to speak, or some ground where Christians can engage with all of those cultures, which of course are still with us. Right? Even though the high modernity he was centrally contending with has faded away, as has indeed the stuff that McDowell and Schaeffer in their different ways were contending with in the 1960s and 70s to some extent. So, yeah, I think Lewis still remains relevant for us today. But we are now in a very strange period of history. And what we're going to do in next week is look at some of the bizarre circumstances that we find ourselves in, and the really strange fact that some of the best apologetics for Christianity is being done by people who are either not yet Christians but are tilting that way, or have only very recently become so. People who are, at a minimum, calling the dogs off from constantly attacking Christianity because they have stared into the abyss and seen with Nietzsche that it's appalling. Well, Nietzsche kept staring and just went literally mad and died in a lunatic asylum. The others have decided this is not really where they want to go, and so they're looking elsewhere. And we're going to be exploring that kind of territory next week.
The light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak.
Who knows where we are in the tunnel, eh? But let's yes, we will charitably suppose. So thank you for staying with us, everybody, and we will look forward to seeing you again next week. So thank you and goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me also.
Okay. Bye now.